Understanding the risk. Let's talk about the risks involved when it comes to site restructuring. So, of course, when it comes to restructuring any site, it comes with a level of risk that should be taken into account before getting started. Okay, I say this because typically speaking, even for small sites, you start making changes to the site structure and things are going to get a little bit wobbly. And of course, these are considerations that you should be aware of before, especially for larger sites, before you start pulling things apart and putting them back together. Fluctuations in site performance, ups and downs, like I just said, etc., are normal during a restructure, right? So it's very, very important, and I want to bring particular emphasis to this. It's very normal to see fluctuations in site performance. Sometimes keywords will drop, they'll come back, pages will disappear out of the index, they'll come back. Pages will move up, things will be moving around all over the place, and sometimes those fluctuations, depending upon the significance of the change and the size of the website, sometimes that can go on for a few days through to a couple of weeks to even a couple of months. But it's really important that you understand that fluctuations when making or restructuring a site, fluctuations, that's all part of the process. Now, one thing that I will say in addition to that is it's very, very important that you avoid panic, okay, and unnecessary rollbacks. I have seen SEO consultants implement new site structures. They panic, they think something's broken. They don't give Google time to recrawl and re-index and update its index in accordance with the changes. They panic, they start making rollbacks and changes everywhere else. In a lot of cases, that's actually the worst thing you can do. Okay, you make a change, you need to give it time to implement. But if you make a change and Google is halfway through recrawling and updating its index and you roll back, that's probably worse than just letting Google complete the process. So fluctuations are normal. Avoid panic and unnecessary rollbacks. Now, I will follow that up by saying this, right? Risk versus reward. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's best to leave large, well-established sites as they are, especially if they're performing well, even with poor site structure. I don't want anyone in this community taking a site that's been performing well for 20 years or 15 years and then pulling it apart and destroying the business. You don't want to do that. Okay, so there'll be a trade-off. You'll need to use some common sense here and look and say, okay, well, this thing is performing incredibly well. Should we restructure it? What is greater here, the risk or the reward? For most smaller sites, local SEO, or even small commerce stores, you'll find that you'll be able to perform this step, go through the restructuring process, and things will be things will get a little bit wobbly, but generally speaking, it'll be in the best interest of the business owner, the website, and everything else. In turn, that is, of course, for long-term performance. But like I said, it's very, very important that you take into account the existing standings. You don't want to pull a site apart if it's performing extremely well, if it means that the likelihood or the chances of tanking a site, especially a site that's doing, $250,000 a month in revenue, it's probably not going to be worth it, even if it does have a poor site structure. Now, this is my point that I was just touching on. Things are going to get wobbly. Okay, performance variations, this is all a natural part of restructuring. Fluctuations in site performance in terms of ups and downs are normal during a site structure. Make sure that you don't panic, okay? You don't panic, avoid panic, unnecessary rollbacks. Oftentimes, and I make a point of saying this, oftentimes sites get worse before they get better, okay? You just need to ride it out. There is, however, it is important that you monitor closely, which is my point here. Monitor closely within rank tracking software and Google Search Console But there'll be a period of time where it'll get worse, and then slowly but surely, as you continue working on the site, it should improve. However, having said that, if it's been like 3 months and it's still fallen off a cliff, something is desperately wrong. Okay. Now, when it comes to monitoring, I would not be using. Look, don't make the mistake of using rank tracking software explicitly. Right? You want to use. If you're going to use something, use Google Search Console and look at the average impressions, the positioning of the average impressions, okay? Because the difference between those two metrics is that if you're looking at a keyword, if you're looking at a handful of keywords, well, you might find that some of those keywords might go up. Maybe they'll stay the same. Especially if you're only monitoring, 5 or 6 keywords, okay, everything looks to be fine. These 5 or 6 terms are still performing really well. But little do you know, the average positioning within the SERPs has absolutely tanked. Okay, now you'll be able to see this number if you look in Google Search Console. So each and every time I went through a large restructure, I always monitored Google Search Console and I pay particular attention to the average positioning. Okay, I want to know overall for the site-wide, is everything going up? Is it remaining stable, or is it absolutely tanking? If you've been through this process, you'll know that typically speaking, things get a little bit wobbly, but then they come good. Communication is key. I can't stress this enough. Anytime you're going through this process, you're restructuring a site, a client site, even for smaller sites, it's very, very important that communicate with the client. Okay, feedback is essential. Firstly, I'll start with this point. Before going live with a new site structure, you may want to consider meeting with clients to gather feedback and share inputs. Communication everywhere throughout the entire process, before, during, and after, is absolutely key. But in terms of feedback, just some quick thoughts around this. If you're unsure about the site structure and which areas of the site, because you might find there'll be some sections of the website that are redundant. You're not sure if they're still in use. Are these pages still relevant? These pages aren't getting any traffic. You'll probably have to have a conversation somewhere with the client to get their feedback. You'll also, especially if you're working in an obscure niche, want to check the terminology and wording around certain phrases or terms that you may have chosen to use in your URLs. It's always best to ask the client and say, okay, this is the existing site structure, this is the proposed site structure. Explain to them why you're recommending those changes and how it's going to be beneficial long term. But also get their feedback in terms of, okay, does it make sense for us to group these topics together here, or should these be separate? Now, having said that, you've got to be really, really careful that you don't get yourself into a situation where the client's input becomes more interference. There's nothing worse than input becoming interference. And this is where the client will start saying, oh, no, move this over here and that needs to go there and we need these pages, because in the client's mind, at least in my experience, the client will be thinking, I just want to rank for every single keyword, so put all of those pages back. Okay, so you'll need to find a balance there between getting meaningful and useful input from the client and avoiding situations where the client just wants to interfere to the point where all of your work has just been reversed and you've just wasted the last 2 or 3 days mapping out the new site structure. Okay, next point here is client communication is key. Like I said, during a restructure, client communication is vital, especially when there are likely to be performance fluctuations and potential outages. You go through the actual changeover, the migration, if you're going to be using niche, pre-built niche-specific templates, if there's going to take the site down, there's going to be a changeover, whatever the case might be, even when you're implementing a restructure. There's usually always going to be performance fluctuations and potential outages. So you've got to communicate with the client and let them know what's going on and what to expect. And just give them the reassurance that you're on top of everything, everything's going to be taken care of. Because the last thing you want to have happen is the client calling you while you're in the middle of a restructure, asking what's going on and the site's down, and that's not good. So you want to avoid those situations. Now, my last point here is updates. Every effort should be made to keep the client updated as much as practically possible. It's definitely before. During can be a little bit tricky, especially if it's a large changeover, and especially after, okay, including ongoing monitoring. The client just wants to know that everything's taken care of, you're going to be monitoring it, and the changeover, the restructure, the implementation of the new structure has gone smoothly without any problems. The next point that I want to touch on here is experience versus ego. I was a little bit hesitant as to whether or not I wanted to include this in the lesson, but I chose to leave it in because there's a couple of things that need to be said here in terms of site restructuring, especially for larger sites. I will start by saying this: most site restructures are usually straightforward, but they can go sideways quickly if you're not careful. You start playing around with redirects, you start updating the HT access file, you start changing navigation, internal links, external links, and everything else. If you don't know what you're doing and you haven't been through this process before, I would not recommend practicing on client sites. This is maybe something you should work on in the staging environment on some of your own properties, or bring someone on that has the experience that can perform this work for you. Like I said, most restructures are very straightforward, especially for smaller sites. But like I said, they can go sideways quickly if you're not careful, okay? Because there's usually always other things involved that sometimes we don't take into account, like accidentally removing AdWords pages, or accidentally taking down email, screwing up redirects, getting locked out of the WordPress admin console, not having FTP access, all of these things. So you've got to be really, really careful, and only get involved in this if you really know what you're doing. There's really no time for ego. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend trying this on larger, more established sites unless you really know what you're doing. Smaller sites, okay, you picked up a florist, it's a 10-page website. Okay, great. We can make these changes. Even if we get this wrong, it's not going to be the end of the world. Now, in terms of window of recovery, if for any reason something does go wrong, typically speaking, you'll need to move quickly in order to recover. I'm talking about, okay, well, we have screwed something up. The files have become corrupted. We're trying to FTP to the server. Something's gone wrong. We have a backup. Okay, we need to roll back. Okay, you should always position yourself so that you can roll back if something does go wrong, and you should be able to roll back within minutes. Next point is always, always, always work towards reducing the risk. Okay, for most sites, the risk will be minimal. Avoid overexciting clients or causing undue concern. Okay, there's no need to say, guys, you could lose everything if we do this. You've got to be really, really careful with the type of language that you use with clients. Like I said, most restructures are very straightforward, but always be mindful to avoid overstimulating clients. Rollback strategy: be sure to back the site up. Always back the site up first, and have a clear rollback strategy should the need arise. Now, in terms of backing the site up, for me, I always did that in a staging environment. You should never be implementing a site restructure live, unless, of course, it's a very straightforward, it's a small site, a very straightforward site, that's fine. But if you get into a large e-commerce site where there's like 2,000 products, you should not be doing that live. This is definitely something that I'll be doing in a staging environment. I would have everything mapped out in a live staging environment, not just backed up onto a USB stick or something. I'd have the entire site replicated in a staging environment, the new site structure implemented, all of the redirects and everything mapped out, and then I'll be doing a straight changeover and then applying all of the redirects so it can be done quickly. Okay, and by doing it that way, you'll have the opportunity to test everything before rolling out the changes. You don't always need to do that. Like I said, if it's a small site, 15, 20 pages, 30 pages, you probably don't need to do that. I always took precautions, and I always backed the site up within a staging environment, not just for the fact of having a backup, but also for reference purposes too. because it can be very handy to know what content was on what pages and everything else before the site changed.